Hello. Today I'm going to talk about playing the exchange variation against the Slav and the Semi-Slav. I'm guessing you're going to meet the Slav a lot more often than you'll meet the Semi, but I'll cover both quickly here and also refer to another video that I've made about the exchange variation in general. So the Slav defense is to play c6 against the Queen's Gambit. This does a number of things. It obviously supports the pawn on d5, which is helpful because that's under attack and you want to maintain a stake in the centre. One of the odd things about the Slav is, in fact, one of the things it threatens is to give up that stake in the centre straight away by taking on c4, and before you can capture back, playing a move like b5, which would then protect the pawn on c4. And that's not a disaster for white, but it can be awkward to get the pawn back and keep everything else under control. So I think certainly when you're learning the Queen's Gambit, I usually suggest avoiding that as best you can. You can play, for example, knight to f3, and then after the usual reply, knight to f6, you can play e3, which obviously is unkind to the bishop, but that'll get out one day. The other way of approaching it, in fact, is to play knight to c3 first, and then say after knight to f6 again go e3, and this is the John Watson recommended move order. And you're going to put the bishop on b2 and the other pieces on sensible squares, and it's not a guaranteed advantage, but what is, you just put your pieces on sensible squares and then you have a game of chess. So that's those are two approaches. Now a young man of my acquaintance doesn't seem to like playing e3, so I'm going to suggest another approach so you can get the bishop out, which is to play the exchange variation. So after c6, take on c5, d5 rather, takes on d5, and then after a couple of reasonable moves, you might play bishop to f4, which is a move we can play in other variations of the Queen's Gambit and against some Indian defences. Knight to c6, and now after e3 we've got the setup that we might have been aiming for, with the bishop developed outside the pawn chain, but without, please note, ever leaving the pawn on c4 to be taken and for black to be awkward about it. Black's got several replies in this position. Some players may play e6, but I think that's a bit of a gift because it blocks in the bishop on c8. I mean, it's perfectly solid. You're not going to wipe out black after a move like that, but it's that's the least scary move, I think, to see in this position. So going back to e3, what else might black play? Bishop to f5 is obviously countering the white's idea of playing the bishop to a best square by playing their own bishop to a best square. There's a little trick here which you can try, in fact, which is queen to b3, which is a little bit awkward because black, having developed the bishop, has abandoned the b7 pawn. So queen to b3 is awkward. If black plays queen to b6, you take it and you've got double pawns to have a go at. Queen to c8 and you lose the d pawn. Queen to d7 and you can play knight to e5 at some point and irritate the queen. So actually in this position, black very often will play something like knight to a5, not something like exactly knight to a5, and after bishop to after queen to a4 check rather, bishop to d7, queen to c2, we've managed to persuade black to displace two of their better pieces. The knight's gone from c6, which is a good square for it, and the bishop's gone from f5, which is a good square for it, and it can't move back. So that's a nice little trick that we can play against lots of variations by black. So for example, after, instead of bishop to f5, bishop to g4, and again we've got this same trick, queen to b3, knight a5 check, and we've reached the same position where we persuaded black to undevelop the bishop. After bishop to g4, instead of instead of the queen move, f3 isn't a bad move. Bishop to h5, and now something like h4 is threatening to trap the bishop. The bishop needs to move out of the way, perhaps with bishop to g6. And now if h5, it can be taken by the minor pieces. So we'll play early on, just play on the other side, queen to b3. Queen to d7 is okay now because the knight doesn't have a route through to e5, which is never going to be irritating. But b5 is an idea, so that we're going to knock out the knight on f6, and then play to win the bishop. And if a natural move like e6 is played, which is a terrible mistake, that's exactly what we can do. Takes an f6, takes an f6, h5, bishop to f5, and g4, and good night, nurse. So that's another little idea. I'll look at this idea in a longer game, play between Vladimir Moskalenko and chap whose name I'm not sure I can pronounce correctly, but let's have a go at Gagatalgi from Barcelona in 2012. And Black, instead of playing any of these very committal moves, Black plays a6, which is an idea that started to circulate before 2000. Black just waits for White to place their pieces before deciding where to put theirs. So for example, after knight to f3 by White, bishop to g4 is very sensible and very effective. It's a fine square for the bishop. It takes away White's control of the e5 square, and obviously you don't have f3 as a way of responding to it. So after a6, something like rook to c1, and Black at this point might play bishop to g4, and now f3 as the same idea as we've seen before in a couple of positions. And in this game the bishop went back to d7. White plays bishop to d3, Black e6, and now g4, not chasing the bishop this time but the knight, and gaining a bit of space on the king side. Rook to c8, knight on g to e2, and knight to a5, hoping to sink the knight into c4 and create some problems perhaps. And in this position White's got a number of ways of playing this. h4 is a reasonable try, knight to g3 is a reasonable try, and Moskalenko actually played in this position king to f2, saying that the rook is well placed on h1 to support the advance of the h4, the h pawn to h4, and therefore no need to move it, no need to castle, and we'll just leave the king in the middle. Sorry, take the king out of the middle by moving it to f2, and it doesn't look as though Black's going to be able to attack the king anytime soon. Bishop to e7, all still very solid. h4, knight to c4, rook to c2, b5. So the two sides have said, well, I'm going to go on the. White said I'm going to go on the king side. Black says I'm going to go on the queen side. And now White decides to reorganise their position on the queen side to counter Black's ideas. Bishop to c6, and now b3, getting rid of that awkward knight. Knight to d6, and White carries on with some natural moves. Knight to g3, knight to d2, and now queen to b1. Perhaps White's going to play on the king side, king side, with looking at this long diagonal, creating a battery down to h7, which we can unveil at some point. So if the Black bishop takes the h pawn now, which was being left as bait, I wonder what the right move is. I suspect it might be something like bishop takes h7, and if the king takes, we've got rook takes c6 check, and whatever Black does next we can play rook takes c8, hitting the queen and perhaps distracting it from its defence of the bishop on h4, which is now also pinned. So I think that was White's idea. So after queen to b1, Black plays f5, takes and takes, takes and takes, and now White switches to the other side with rook on h to c1, leaving the h pawn as a gambit. King to h2, bishop to g5, and now takes, takes and takes, and White has a piece for a pawn and a messed up position. That's a risky play by White, but in fact, although the king in the centre looks very vulnerable, White's pieces are just about active enough to keep it under control. Queen to h2 check, king moves up, king to e8, and now the bishop can step in, bishop e8 check, and f5. That bishop's going to be very hard to dislodge now. And Black's just a piece down with not enough compensation, and resigned. So an exciting sort of game, rather different to the usual stodgy stuff that we used to get with the Slav exchange. I mean, when I was a boy, we used to play it with pretty much the same sorts of ideas, but would allow after we play an early knight to f3, e3, and play bishop to b5. That's still a system, and it may give you a whisper of an advantage, but I like this new idea of delaying knight to f3. So exchange Slav with a delayed knight to f3. The other situation where you might meet the c6 idea is in the main line of the Queen's Gambit. We get to this position, and although I think you might want to play bishop to f4 here, I think bishop to d6 and c5 and bishop to b4 all equalise for Black. What you really want to do is wait for bishop to f4 until Black has played something like bishop to e7, and after bishop to e7 lots of those ideas are not so effective, and you can play bishop to f4 happily. One other opportunity for Black in this position is, instead of playing any of those moves, after knight to f3, Black might try c6. Now this is the semi-Slav, so it's a bit, it's like the Orthodox. It's half like the Orthodox, it's half like the Slav. It's the semi-Slav. And again, I'm quite happy with the system with e3, and playing much as John Watson recommended with b3 and queen c2 and so on. Sensible development, and have a game of chess. But if you don't like that blocking in of the bishop on c1, we can try instead playing the exchange variation, c takes d5. Now c takes d5 is going to lead to a poor version of the lines that we've already looked at, where White's got a good bishop and Black's got a bad one. So I think that's all fine for the White cause. So after c takes d5, e takes d5 is better. Now we've given up, by this move order, some of White's better ideas in the exchange Queen's Gambit, for which see the other video I'll put in the description below this one. So we need to be very accurate with our move order. If we just play something ordinary here, you can give up on having an advantage. So bishop to c4, bishop to f4, or bishop to g5 are going to be met with Black playing bishop to f5, and as Black's got every excuse to claim equality here. So after e takes d5, we've got to stop that good bishop to f5 move, and we're going to do that by playing queen to c2, so which is a funny move this early in the game to develop your queen, but it's absolutely right in this position. We have to stop that development, and after bishop to e7, bishop to f4, and we just carry on developing as well we might. And in this position, which I'm sure you can get to in most of the games with this line, Black very often plays knight to f8, trying to think about a place to put the bishop, and also reorganising the kingside. And now white's got several moves here which are okay. h3 is one of them, just taking away some ideas for black to play. Well, it obviously stops anything going to to g4, and it also gives a square for the bishop to drop back to if black decides to take it. So we're going to keep control of this long diagonal and not be chased off it or swapped off by the knight. So that's a nice idea, h3. Another way to play is rook on a to b1, and if you look at the other video I've talked about this minority attack, trying to beat up black's queen side, because that's where your pawns are pointing, using the pawn pointing rule. That's where you've got more space, and you've also got this half open file. So everything about this position, particularly the way you've developed your pieces so far, suggests you're not going to attack on the king side. You are going to attack on the queen side, and the way to do that is to use the b pawn as a battering ram and try and create some weaknesses. You're not going for mate. It's not a crash bang wallop sort of game, but the queen's gambit's rarely a crash bang wallop sort of opening. And we're trying to create some weaknesses and win a longer game, but safely by playing on the queen side. So that's it. Two variations of the exchange ideas, two exchange systems in the Queen's Gambit for white against the Slav and the Semi-Slav.